Tom Pryce, the only Welshman ever to win a Formula One race, was believed by many to be destined to be a world champion. He never had an opportunity to write his name large in the pages of Formula One history because he was killed in one of the most unfortunate and gruesome accidents Formula One has ever experienced. His name is forever tied to the terrible events of the awful day at Kyalami in March 1977. One which makes even those who remember the brutal deaths of Francois Cervera, Helmut Koenig and Roger Williamson wince. Pryce was born in 1949 in Ruthin, a small town in Wales, and he developed a passion for cars at an early age. By his teenage years, he was already modifying them to improve performance. In 1963, he entered his first competitive race in a modest sports car. Early success fueled a desire for more. His family did everything within their modest means to help him develop his career, providing financial and moral support. By 1965, Pryce had entered the world of single-seater racing, competing in Formula Ford and later in Formula 3. And his obvious talent resulted in a move into Formula 2, driving for the Rondell team of Ron Dennis. A second place in his penultimate race for the team was enough to convince sponsors Tony Vasopoulos and Ken Grob that he had the speed to enter Formula One, and they created a new team for the 1974 season, Token Racing, to make it happen. Sadly, the car was a disaster and embarrassingly slow. At the non-championship BRDC International Trophy, Pryce was over 16 seconds away from pole position, and in its first World Championship race in Belgium, he was 3 seconds off the pace. The driver and car were refused entry to the Monaco Grand Prix, and Pryce departed the operation shortly after, joining the Shadow team as the permanent replacement to American Peter Revson, who had been killed in practice for the South African Grand Prix earlier in the season. Pryce made his debut for Shadow at the Dutch Grand Prix, qualifying an impressive 11th place on the grid, although he was eliminated by James Hunt before completing the first lap. In France, his second race for the team, Pryce shocked the establishment by qualifying the Shadow in 3rd place on the grid. But race day was once more drastically shortened after he made a poor start and was eliminated after a first lap collision with Carlos Reutemann and James Hunt. The British Grand Prix proved that Pryce's speed was no flash in the pan, qualifying the Shadow in 5th place, and this time making it to the finish in 8th place, despite chassis failure, which made the car handle strangely and also reduced him to just 4th and 5th gears as the gear selector was being fouled by the broken chassis member. One race later, at the German Grand Prix, Pryce scored his first World Championship point by taking 6th place at the Nürburgring. His performances in the Shadow in 1974 had aroused the attention of Colin Chapman, and there was an attempt by the Lotus owner to engineer a driver swap with Shadow in 1975, bringing Pryce to Lotus and sending Ronnie Peterson to Shadow. The motive for the proposed change was financial. Lotus were once more struggling with money worries, and Chapman figured that he could offload Peterson's salary to Shadow and get a driver who was nearly as fast on the cheap. Whether Shadow could have leveraged the Swede's high profile to attract a sponsor who could pay his salary was another matter entirely, and the deal fell through. So, for 1975, Pryce would stay with the Shadow team. The new Shadow DN5 was fast, but the team only had one ready for the start of the season, and it was handed to Jean-Pierre Jarier, whose sponsorship was helping to pay the bills. Jarier took pole position for the first 2 races of the season. However, mechanical problems meant that he didn't start the race in Argentina and ended his race early in Brazil. Pryce got his first run in the new car in South Africa, but a disappointing qualifying session meant that he had a hard race to eventually finish in 9th place. 2 weeks later, the teams were back in the UK at Brands Hatch for the non-championship race of champions. March in the UK can be an unpleasant place to be racing. and this may have the distinction of being the only Formula One race to start in snowy conditions. Cold, wet conditions were a boon for Pryce, who had always excelled in wet races, and having claimed pole position, he went on to claim the race by more than 30 seconds from John Watson and Ronnie Peterson. It was a popular victory with the home crowd, and it made Pryce the first, and to date, only Welshman to win a Formula One race. In Spain, Pryce qualified 8th and was eliminated in a collision just 2 laps before the tragic events which were to end Grand Prix racing at Montjuic Park. Race leader Rolf Stommelen had a rear wing failure, which launched his car over the circuit's barriers and into the crowd. 4 people died, and the race was stopped once the seriousness of the accident was understood. It was the first time a Grand Prix had been stopped and half points awarded, whilst by finishing 6th, Lella Lombardi became the first woman to win a point, or technically half a point, in Formula One history. At Monaco for the next race, Pryce qualified on the front row of the grid, alongside championship favourite Niki Lauda, with teammate Jarier in 3rd. But the race was not kind to the 2 shadow drivers, with both spinning off on a wet track. In the following races, Pryce made amends, qualifying well up the field and scoring points in both Belgium and Holland. Pryce then followed this up with the only pole position of his career at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. On race day, he was involved in a battle for the lead with Carlos Pace and Clay Recordsoni, when a sudden rainstorm brought chaos by soaking the far side of the circuit, catching out both Recordsoni and Pryce. The race was to descend into chaos, as some drivers pitted for wet tyres, whilst others tried to stay out on slicks on the now drying track. Eventually, with all the cars now on slick tyres, another downpour arrived, which caused 2 monumental pile-ups, with 3 cars crashing at Stowe Corner and 8 at Club Corner. Jarier and Depailler also had separate incidents of their own, and with 2 drivers and several spectators injured, the race was stopped and chaos ensued before a result was officially announced. In the following races in Germany and Austria, Pryce was to score the best results of his career to date, first taking 4th place at the Nürburgring, and then enhancing his growing reputation with a 3rd place and his first podium finish at the Österreichring. It had been another black weekend for the sport, with Wilson Fittipaldi being injured in a qualifying accident, and then Mark Donoghue being killed in an accident in the Sunday morning warm-up session when a puncture caused his car to leave the track and crash into the barriers before wiping out a marshal's post, killing one marshal and injuring another. The race itself was wet, and Pryce scythed through the field, revelling in the conditions, and was closing in on James Hunt's 2nd place when a number of spins caused by the volume of water on the track persuaded the stewards to stop the race. 38-year-old Vittorio Brambilla, also known as the Monza Gorilla, claimed the only victory of his career and celebrated so wildly that he crashed immediately after passing the checkered flag. A strong finish to the season promised much for 1976, with Pryce and Jarier being retained for the coming season. The year started strongly, with Pryce recovering from a disappointing qualifying session to claim the 2nd podium of his career in Brazil, finishing in 3rd place behind Niki Lauda and Patrick Depailler. Pryce qualified well in the next 2 races, but then in the 4th race of the season, a new rule was introduced to limit the height and size of the airboxes on the cars. Shadow was particularly affected by this change, and what had promised to be a good season went south. Pryce scored a surprise 4th place at the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch. He always seemed to go well in front of his home crowd, and repeated the feat in Holland after qualifying in a surprising 3rd place on the grid. Otherwise, there were no points finishes, and the Shadow team entered the 1977 season with money worries on its mind. These worries were resolved by replacing the ATS-bound Jarier with Italian Renzo Zorzi, who had competed in 2 Grand Prix as a pay driver for the Williams team, and brought cash to Shadow in return for a race seat. In the first 2 races of the season, Pryce qualified in the midfield, but problems on race day meant he was not classified in either race. It was Zorzi who somewhat surprisingly converted a poor qualifying position to a sixth-place finish in Brazil, claiming the team's first points of the season. And then we come to the third race at Kyalami. The weekend had started well for Pryce. Uncharacteristic rain was falling for first practice in South Africa, and Pryce used his obvious wet weather skills to end the day fastest of all. Thursday was dry, so Pryce slipped back down the field to qualify in 19th place for Saturday's race. On Saturday, Pryce had made a poor start and slipped to the back of the field before recovering to pass the back markers, and was engaged in a battle with Hans-Joachim Stuck, Jacques Lafitte and Gunnar Nilsson when fate was to intervene terribly. On lap 22, Zorzi's car started to misfire and then stutter as it went down the pit straight. Zorzi pulled over to the left of the track. A fuel pipe had become disconnected, and as Zorzi prepared to exit his car, fuel leaking from the pipe ignited, causing a fire. Zorzi struggled to disconnect his air supply pipe and seemed to panic. That panic spread to the marshals, and two of their number, who were located on the pit side of the straight, hopped over the barrier and ran across the track to assist the Italian. A number of factors came into play at this point. In 1977, the cars were cresting the rise on the Crowthorne Straight at between 160 and 170 miles an hour. When the two marshals looked back down the track, their view of oncoming cars would have been obscured by the crest in the straight, and before that a flat-out corner called the Kink, meaning they could only really see 20 to 30 metres of track and nothing beyond the rise. As the two marshals ran across the track, Stuck and Pryce crested the rise. Stuck in the lead, and Pryce tucked under his wing, seeking some slipstream for a passing manoeuvre down the long straight. Stuck saw the marshals and swung right, barely missing them. However, Pryce had no time to react and slammed into the second marshal, Frederik Jansen von Vuren, who was just 19 years old. The impact, at close to 170 miles per hour, dismembered the young boy, with his badly mutilated body being thrown across the road and landing in front of Zorzi's car. The fire extinguisher he had been carrying smashed straight into Pryce's helmet, killing the driver instantly. Evidence of the lack of time Pryce had to react was that his foot was still hard down to the floor, and the car carried on down the straight before smashing into the side of Lafitte's Ligier as the latter attempted to take Crowthorne Corner. The Shadow, with its driver dead at the wheel, ploughed head-on into the barriers, whilst Lafitte's car spun into the catch fencing. Pryce's death was appalling and unnecessary. The two marshals who crossed the track had not been given approval to do so, and the horrible mutilation of Van Vuren's body was so shocking that it wasn't even possible to identify him until after the race, when all the marshals were gathered together. At 27 years old, Pryce had competed in 42 Grand Prix, claimed one pole position and 2 podium finishes. Not an especially notable achievement based on statistics alone. However, his performances behind the wheel had marked him out as a star, and at the time of his death, negotiations were underway for him to drive for Lotus alongside Mario Andretti in 1978. Pryce's progress in the Lotus 79 would have been something to see. Instead, Pryce is remembered mostly for the terrible accident which claimed his life, an unfortunate way to remember a talented individual.